There are people who walk through the world with a softness that is not shaken by judgment. People who do not bend under glances, or pause to rewrite themselves in the mirror of someone else's expectations. Their calm is not rebellion. It is the quiet knowledge that life is too brief to be lived in borrowed voices. You've seen them, moving with a steady presence, unhurried, unbothered, untouched by the noise around them. Not because they feel superior, but because something inside them has settled. Because the world's approval no longer feels like oxygen. And in their silence, there is a kind of freedom that many spend their whole lives trying to understand. This is the psychology of those who no longer seek permission to exist. There is a moment in every life when the world begins to make its expectations known. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through the subtle tightening of a parent's voice, or the lingering pause in a stranger's eyes. Sometimes it comes loudly, like a verdict delivered before a person has even learned how to defend who they are. But however it arrives, the message is the same. People are watching you. For many, this awareness becomes a lifelong mirror. A place where every movement is rehearsed, every expression softened, every truth edited so it lands cleanly in the hands of others. Most learn to live inside this mirror without noticing how small it slowly becomes. How the frame narrows. How they begin walking with their shoulders slightly tense, waiting for approval that never quite satisfies. But for a certain kind of person, something different happens. The recognition of judgment does not pull them inward. It pushes them toward themselves. It begins subtly. At first, they notice the sensation of being observed. The pressure, the anticipation, the unspoken rules. They feel the weight of opinions just like everyone else. But as the world asks them to shrink or bend, something inside resists. Not in rebellion, not in anger, but in quiet confusion. They wonder why so much of human life is shaped by other people's invisible expectations. Why a single raised eyebrow can alter someone's entire personality. Why voices outside seem to speak louder than the one within. And so they watch. They listen. They observe how people adjust themselves in every social space, constantly editing their reactions as if life were a stage with no intermission. They see how others soften their laughter, hide their sadness, pretend to be smaller or louder or happier than they feel. They notice how often humans contort themselves into acceptable shapes, hoping that approval will bring peace. For them, this realization becomes the first fracture. A quiet split between the self they sense inside and the roles the world demands. And in this fracture, a seed is planted, the seed of emotional independence. It does not grow overnight. At first, it simply creates questions. Why does their value depend on someone else's interpretation? Why must their identity be a negotiation? Why does external validation feel like a currency they were forced to earn? These questions do not make them fearless. They do not immediately turn into people who walk untouched by judgment. Instead, the early stage feels unsettling. Like standing at the edge of a crowded room and noticing for the first time that everyone is performing something. Everyone is trying to be seen, yet no one seems to truly see themselves. And in that uncomfortable clarity, they begin to sense that approval is not the same as understanding. That attention is not the same as acceptance. That being liked is not the same as being known. This is the first recognition. The quiet awareness that living for others is not truly living at all. From here, the emotional shift begins. They start to test the boundaries, sometimes gently, sometimes without meaning to. A small honesty slips out. A preference is voiced without apology. A truth is expressed even when it doesn't fit the moment. And they notice that the world does not fall apart. They begin to realize that judgment is often fleeting. That opinions change with mood, with memory, with the shifting winds of someone else's insecurities. And slowly they start stepping out of the mirror. Not fully, not confidently, but enough to feel the first breath of air that is entirely their own. This chapter of life is not about becoming bold. It is about becoming aware that the self is not meant to be shaped solely by the eyes that look upon it. It is the quiet beginning of emotional autonomy, the moment when a person first understands that freedom does not start with defiance. It starts with recognition. Every pattern in adulthood has an origin. Even the quiet confidence of those who do not bend to opinions is not born out of nowhere. It grows from the soil of early experiences, childhood rooms, emotional atmospheres, the invisible rules of families, and the shape of the world they learn to navigate. Some people develop independence because they were trusted, some because they were ignored, and some because life required it long before they understood what it meant. The roots vary, but the soil always matters. For a few, the foundation begins with warmth. They were raised by people who listened without judgment, who allowed mistakes without shaming, who taught them, subtly, that their voice mattered simply because it was theirs. In homes like these, authenticity does not feel risky. A child who grows up being seen learns a quiet truth: the world does not end when they are themselves. This early permission creates an internal anchor. They learn to trust their own feelings before the world has a chance to rewrite them. They learn that approval is pleasant but not necessary. They learn that identity can exist even without applause. And so, when they eventually enter the world, they walk with a natural ease, carrying the calm certainty that they do not need to perform to be accepted. But that is only one path. The opposite path is shaped by a different kind of upbringing, one filled with emotional distance, inconsistency, or quiet neglect. Some children learn early that no matter what they do, praise will not come. Their achievements go unnoticed, or their emotions are dismissed before they fully form. And so they stop reaching. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Approval is unreliable. Strangely, this absence of validation creates its own kind of freedom. These children become self-contained, learning to soothe themselves, comfort themselves, entertain themselves. Their inner world becomes their refuge, and they grow accustomed to moving through life without expecting others to mirror them. By the time they reach adulthood, external opinions hold little weight, not because they never wanted them, but because they learn not to depend on them. There is also a third path, the path of necessity. Some were thrust into independence early, caring for younger siblings, navigating chaos, managing emotional storms in the people around them. They learned to take responsibility before they were ready, to make decisions without guidance, to stand firm when everything else was unstable. And so they developed a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that adulthood only strengthened. For these individuals, caring too much about opinions feels impractical. They have lived through realities where survival mattered more than approval. Compared to what they endured, judgment feels small, background noise rather than a threat. Their independence is not philosophical. It is instinctual. Yet, regardless of which path formed them, all these individuals share a common thread. Their sense of self was shaped internally, not externally. They learned, through warmth, neglect, or necessity, that identity cannot remain stable if its foundation relies on the volatility of others. They learned that approval is unpredictable, that expectations shift, that people praise you one day and question you the next. And so they built a self that stood regardless of the conditions around it. Childhood, for them, was not merely a stage of life. It was a silent apprenticeship in emotional independence. And though they may not realize it until much later, this early wiring creates the very psychology that will one day separate them from the crowd. It forms the inner backbone that allows them to say without arrogance, "I know who I am," even when the world tries to tell them otherwise. The roots of those who do not care about opinions are rarely simple, but they all trace back to a moment, whether gentle or painful, when a young mind first learned to stand without needing someone else to hold it steady. There is a quiet architecture beneath every human behavior, patterns of thought, chemistry, wiring, and perception shaping how we respond to the world. People who do not care about others' opinions are not simply born with a shield. Their minds work differently. Their emotional systems process social information in ways that loosen the grip of judgment. To understand them, the science must be approached gently, not as formulas or hard lines, but as the soft mechanics of human experience. At the center of this detachment is something called self-referencing. Most people build their choices around how they imagine others will perceive them. The brain scans for threat, for approval, for belonging. It is an ancient survival instinct. Years ago, being rejected meant danger. The nervous system still remembers that. But some individuals rely less on the external world when evaluating themselves. Their internal compass is stronger. Their sense of identity is more anchored, less porous. So when feedback arrives, positive or negative, it enters the mind with less force. It does not flood. It does not shake the foundation. Psychologists call this low social evaluative sensitivity. It means their sense of self does not hinge on being admired or accepted. Their emotional equilibrium does not rise and fall with someone else's mood. Where others ask, "What will they think?" these individuals ask, "What do I know about myself?" That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Another piece of this puzzle lies in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for regulation, reflection, and perspective. People who are less affected by opinions tend to engage this region more effectively. They pause before reacting. They evaluate what matters and what does not. They notice judgment, but they do not overinterpret it. Their minds create distance, making room for clarity. This ability to step back is not coldness. It is cognitive grounding. They see that many opinions are projections, shaped by other people's fears, biases, insecurities, and unspoken needs. They understand that someone else's perspective says more about the speaker than the subject. And so they absorb only what aligns with their truth, letting the rest pass through like wind through an open window. Detachment is also connected to emotional regulation. Some personalities naturally return to baseline quicker after emotional disruption. They feel the sting of criticism, but it settles. It does not spiral. Their inner world is less volatile, less dependent on external soothing. This steadiness creates a unique psychological effect. They do not fear judgment because they know they can endure it. Where others brace for social pain, they experience it as temporary discomfort, nothing more. Identity plays a role as well. Those with a solid sense of self, whether built through reflection, hardship, or early support, anchor their worth internally. They do not look outward for confirmation because they trust their inner narrative. Their values, preferences, and boundaries feel internally authored rather than borrowed. This internal authorship is the essence of psychological independence. It allows them to meet the world without constantly adjusting who they are. It allows them to interact without performing. It allows them to exist without seeking spotlight or shielding themselves from shadows. Lastly, there is temperament. Some people simply feel less threatened by social disapproval. Their nervous system does not interpret judgment as danger. Their biology leans toward steadiness rather than reactivity. This natural baseline gives them the emotional space to focus on what matters and let go of what doesn't. Together, these elements, brain patterns, identity stability, emotional regulation, temperament, form a quiet science. A combination of biology and psychology that allows certain individuals to walk through the world lightly, even when surrounded by noise. They are not unaffected because they are fearless. They are unaffected because their minds have learned, in their own intricate ways, that opinions are fleeting, that judgment is subjective, that self-worth must rest inside, not outside. This is the science of their calm. the invisible mechanism behind their freedom. From the outside, people who do not care about others' opinions often appear unshakable, calm, grounded, untouched by noise. But the inner world tells a softer, more complicated story. Detachment is not the absence of emotion. It is the quiet negotiation between wanting to belong and wanting to be free. Because even the strongest sense of self carries a shadow. The first shadow is misunderstanding. To many, their independence is mistaken for arrogance. Their calm is perceived as indifference. Their silence is interpreted as distance. And so they often stand on the edges of social circles, not because they reject connection, but because connection asks for a kind of performance they no longer wish to give. This creates an invisible tension, the longing for genuine closeness, and the refusal to reshape themselves to achieve it. They watch others bond through conformity, through shared masks, through synchronized opinions. And sometimes, just for a moment, they wonder what it would feel like to be easily understood. To walk into a room and not have their detachment mistaken for coldness. To be accepted without explanation. But they know the cost. To soften their boundaries. To filter their truth. To care about impressions they have worked so hard to let go of. And so they choose honesty over belonging. Even when the honesty feels lonely. Another part of the conflict lies in the human instinct for social survival. Even those who are emotionally independent cannot escape biology. The nervous system still reacts when excluded. The heart still tightens at the thought of disappointing someone they care about. The mind still wonders occasionally if detachment has become a barrier rather than a shield. There are nights when they revisit old moments. A comment misunderstood. A silence misread. A truth that made someone uncomfortable. And they question whether their independence has distanced them more than expected. Because the paradox is this. They do not seek approval, yet they still desire connection. Two needs that rarely coexist peacefully. Then comes the resistance, the pressure from others who cannot understand a life lived without constant self-editing. Family members who say they are too blunt. Friends who wish they cared more. People who feel threatened by someone who does not bend at the slightest breeze of judgment. To some, their detachment feels like rejection. To others, it feels like rebellion. To a few, it feels like a mirror reflecting their own insecurities. And so these individuals often carry the weight of being misunderstood, not because they are difficult, but because they refuse to wear identities that do not belong to them. Yet the deepest conflict is internal. The tug-of-war between staying true to oneself and adapting to the world's expectations. There are moments when caring becomes tempting. Moments when they catch themselves wondering if life would be simpler with softer boundaries, with easier compliance, with a little more willingness to be shaped. But the thought is fleeting, because they remember what it felt like to be governed by opinions, the exhaustion, the confusion, the endless adjusting, the way it made life feel like a room with shrinking walls. They know that caring too much was the heaviest weight they ever carried, and so they do not return to it. Even in their moments of doubt, they anchor themselves gently, not with defiance, but with truth. I am not indifferent, their inner voice whispers. I am simply no longer willing to trade myself for approval. This chapter of their psychology is where the world misunderstands them the most. It is not that they reject others. It is that they reject the version of themselves created for others. The inner conflict does not weaken them. It humanizes them. Because beneath the calm exterior lies a heart that feels deeply, just not in the direction the world expects. There is always a moment, quiet, uncelebrated, almost invisible, when a person finally releases the weight of other people's expectations. It doesn't arrive as a grand realization or a dramatic transformation. It arrives softly, like a truth that has been waiting for years to be heard. For those who no longer care about others' opinions, The turning point is rarely a single event. It is a slow unfurling, a collection of small awakenings that gather in the mind until one day, everything feels different. Often it begins with exhaustion. Not the kind that rests with sleep, but the emotional fatigue of constantly managing impressions. They grow tired of performing, tired of explaining, tired of shaping themselves into a version that earns approval but never feels like home. They notice the subtle drain in pretending, the heaviness of forcing a smile, the quiet ache of withholding truths in rooms where honesty feels too fragile. And gradually they recognize a simple reality: the cost of being liked is too high. This is the first shift, a soft rebellion within the heart, a whisper that says, there must be another way to live. Sometimes the turning point comes through pain, a moment of betrayal, criticism, or loss that strips away the illusion that pleasing others guarantees safety. They learn that even their best efforts cannot control how others see them, that someone can misunderstand them despite their softness, that someone can judge them despite their intention, that someone can leave despite their consistency. And in that painful clarity, something loosens inside them. They stop holding on so tightly. They stop negotiating their worth through someone else's lens. They realize that if judgment is inevitable, then authenticity is the only choice that makes sense. For others, the shift comes through stillness. A quiet moment alone, perhaps in the late hours of the night, when the world feels muted enough for the mind to speak freely. In that silence, they reflect on the years spent bending themselves into acceptable shapes. They remember how often they abandoned pieces of who they were for temporary approval. They notice the distance between their true self and the version they present. And the question forms: who would I be if I stopped trying to be understood? The answer arrives slowly, but it arrives with a soft kind of certainty. A turning point is not the building of strength. It is the recognition of it. These individuals begin to trust their intuition more deeply. They begin to choose peace over conformity. They begin to value alignment over acceptance. They no longer look at a room wondering how to fit in. They look at a room wondering whether it fits them. This shift is subtle but profound. Judgment loses its power because it no longer defines anything essential. Approval becomes a preference, not a need. Criticism becomes information, not identity. They begin to see that other people's opinions are weather, ever-changing, often unpredictable, and rarely about them. The internal landscape becomes the place of truth, not the crowd, not the noise, not the fleeting reactions of passing strangers. And then, without fanfare, they arrive at the quiet realization that changes everything. My life is mine, not borrowed, not edited, not shaped by unseen eyes or imagined voices. This realization is not loud. It does not demand celebration. It simply settles into the mind like a dawn that was always coming. From here, everything shifts, not dramatically but naturally, like a river returning to its course, like a breath finally released after years of being held. The turning point is not an end. It is the beginning of living without permission. A soft unlocking that allows a person to exist as they truly are. Unfiltered, unperformed, unafraid of being misunderstood. It is the doorway to freedom. After the turning point, something shifts quietly inside a person who no longer lives through the eyes of others. It is not a transformation marked by boldness or defiance. It is a settling, a gentle alignment between their inner world and the life they choose to live. This stage is not about rejecting society. It is about returning to themselves. Integration begins with small choices. They wake up and dress according to comfort, not impression. They speak without calculating the audience. They say no without guilt. They say yes without needing applause. Their decisions become rooted in authenticity rather than expectation. The world does not always understand this shift. To some, their simplicity looks like confidence. To others, it looks like detachment. But to them, it feels like breathing clearly for the first time. They are not trying to stand out. They are simply no longer trying to disappear. One of the most profound changes is the way they relate to others. They listen more deeply. Not to respond in the right way, but to understand. They no longer filter their reactions through the question, "Will this make me look good?" Instead, they show up as they are. Sometimes quiet, sometimes expressive, always sincere. This sincerity becomes a quiet magnet. People sense the absence of pretense. Conversations feel grounded. Relationships feel easier. Interactions feel lighter, no longer burdened by silent negotiations of approval. Paradoxically, by not caring about opinions, they create space for more genuine connection. Because authenticity invites authenticity. Another part of integration is emotional steadiness. They experience judgment, disappointment, praise, and misunderstanding like anyone else, but the intensity changes. They do not create walls. They create clarity. They no longer over-explain their limits or apologize for having them. They understand that preserving their energy is not selfishness. It is sustainability. They are able to walk away from conversations that drain them, relationships that diminish them, or environments that require constant self-shaping. Not with anger. Not with grand statements. Just with quiet certainty. Because integration teaches them that peace is a responsibility, not a luxury. Their identity becomes more fluid and natural. They stop trying to maintain a fixed version of themselves. They outgrow the need to be consistent for the sake of others. They allow themselves to change, to evolve, to contradict old beliefs. Not to impress anyone, but to remain honest with their current truth. This fluidity is not instability. It is growth without an audience. The world around them still moves quickly, full of opinions, judgments, and social hierarchies. But they move differently within it. Not above it, not against it, but beside it. They engage without absorbing. They observe without inheriting. They participate without losing themselves. Their presence becomes anchored yet gentle, firm yet compassionate, independent yet connected. This is the essence of integration. Living in harmony with oneself while remaining open to the world. No performance, no tension, no fragmentation. Just a quiet alignment between inner truth and outer life. There is a quiet kind of freedom that does not shout, perform, or seek applause. It moves like soft light through a room, present, calm, steady. This is the poetry of unconcern, the art of living untouched by judgments that were never ours to carry. Unconcern is not indifference. It is a deep, peaceful understanding that you do not need to shrink or swell to fit the expectations of others. It is the awareness that your worth does not tremble in someone else's hands. Most people live as if the world is always watching them. But the truth is softer, almost tender. The world is too busy with its own worries to weigh yours. And even if it wasn't, your life is still yours alone. A story written from the inside, not the outside. There is something cinematic about realizing this. A slow zoom out. A wide shot of your life seen from above. Suddenly the noise gets quieter. The judgments blur into background static. The harsh edges soften. You begin to understand that presence is enough. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to explain the shape of your soul. You simply are, and that is a complete sentence. Freedom, then, is not rebellion but release. It is letting the unnecessary fall away. It is choosing not to carry what was never meant for you. It is standing in your own identity without looking over your shoulder to see who approves. When you stop performing, something beautiful happens. You start living. Your days feel lighter. Your decisions feel cleaner. Your heart feels calmer. You walk through the world like someone who knows where they belong, not because the world said so, but because you did. In the end, the poetry of unconcern is simple. It is the courage to be seen as you are, the softness to stay open, the wisdom to let people think what they will, and the quiet, unshakable truth that nothing anyone says can take away the person you have become. This is the gentle ending, the cinematic fade-out, the soft, reflective moment where you realize you were free all along. And now, finally, you let yourself live like it.